The newspaper headlines screamed it in bold letters, "Gold! Tons of gold discovered in the Klondike." But what they didn't tell you was that getting to that gold meant walking straight into the jaws of death itself. Between 1897 and 1899, 100,000 desperate souls attempted the most treacherous journey in North American history. Only 30,000 would make it to Dawson City alive. This is the story of how they survived the deadliest trail ever carved into the wilderness. Before we dive into this incredible tale of human endurance, make sure you hit that subscribe button and share this video with someone who loves survival stories. Trust me, you'll want to follow along for every brutal detail of what these gold rushers endured. Picture this. You're standing on the docks of Seattle in 1897, watching a steamship called the Portland pull into harbor. The gangplank drops, and men stumble off carrying sacks so heavy they can barely walk. Gold dust spills from canvas bags. Nuggets the size of walnuts roll across the wooden planks. One man carries 68 pounds of pure gold in a simple leather satchel. Another hauls out a fruit jar packed with dust worth $15,000. The crowd goes absolutely silent, then erupts into chaos. This wasn't just news. This was proof, real, tangible proof, that fortunes beyond imagination were waiting in the frozen wilderness of Canada's Yukon Territory. Within hours, the word spread like wildfire through every saloon, every boarding house, every factory floor in Seattle. The Klondike Gold Rush had begun, and it would become the largest human migration of the 19th century. But here's what those newspaper headlines didn't mention. Here's what the steamship companies and supply merchants kept quiet. The journey to reach those gold fields was a death sentence wrapped in false promises. Two main routes led to the Klondike, and both were engineered by nature itself to kill anyone foolish enough to attempt them. The first option was the White Pass Trail, starting from the lawless town of Skagway, Alaska. The second was the Chilkoot Trail, beginning in the nearby port of Daya. Both routes demanded that travelers haul 1 full ton of supplies over mountain passes that rose nearly 4,000 feet into the sky. 1 ton, 2,000 pounds of food, tools, tents, and clothing carried piece by piece on human backs up slopes so steep that one wrong step meant certain death. Let me paint you a picture of what awaited these gold rushers. Imagine standing at the base of the White Pass, looking up at a trail that disappears into swirling clouds of snow and ice. The path ahead is barely 2 feet wide in places, carved into the side of a cliff face that drops into black nothingness below. Sharp rocks jut out like broken teeth, ready to slice open anyone who stumbles. The air is so thin it burns your lungs with every breath. Now imagine making that climb not once, not twice, but 30 or 40 times. Because that's exactly what it took to move a full ton of supplies from the bottom to the top. Each trip up the mountain meant strapping 60 to 80 pounds onto your back and climbing for hours through conditions that would make a modern mountaineer weep. Each trip down meant your knees taking a beating that left grown men crawling on all fours by the end of the day. The sound that haunted the White Pass was unlike anything on Earth. It wasn't the howling wind or the crack of shifting ice. It was the screaming of dying horses. Over 3,000 pack animals perished on this trail, earning it the nickname that still chills historians today, Dead Horse Trail. These weren't quick deaths either. Horses broke legs stepping into hidden crevasses, their bones snapping with sounds like gunshots echoing off the canyon walls. They starved when their loads became too heavy to carry, their ribs showing through matted fur as they collapsed in the snow. Some fell from narrow ledges, their terrified whinnies fading as they tumbled hundreds of feet into rocky gorges below. The worst part? Many of these animals weren't even dead when they hit the ground. They lay there, broken and suffering, as an endless stream of prospectors stepped over their bodies. The trail became literally paved with horse carcasses, their frozen remains serving as stepping stones for the next wave of gold seekers. Men who had never handled livestock in their lives beat these creatures with clubs and whips, desperate to make progress before winter set in completely. But if you thought the White Pass was hell on earth, the Chilkoot Trail was worse in ways that defied description. This route was steeper, colder, and more psychologically devastating than anything most humans had ever attempted. The final ascent to Chilkoot Pass became known as the Golden Stairs, though there was nothing golden about them except the dreams they shattered. Picture a wall of ice and snow rising at a 60-degree angle, higher than a 40-story building. Carved into this wall are 1,500 steps, each one hacked out by hand with axes and shovels. The steps are barely wide enough for one person, and they're slick with ice that never melts. Above you stretches an endless line of black figures, bent double under massive packs, moving at the pace of a funeral march. Below you, the same sight disappears into the mist. This is where the human body reached its absolute breaking point. Men collapsed from exhaustion every few hundred steps, gasping for air in the thin mountain atmosphere, their hearts hammered against their ribs like trapped birds. Sweat froze instantly on their faces, forming masks of ice that cracked and bled with every expression. Some actually died from the sheer physical effort, their hearts simply giving out under the strain. The psychological torture was even worse than the physical punishment. You couldn't pass anyone on those narrow steps. You couldn't rest for more than a few minutes without losing your place in line. If you stepped out of the human chain for any reason, you went to the back and started over. Some men waited 12 hours just to begin their ascent, standing in the bitter cold as the wind cut through their clothes like knives. The sound that defined the Golden Stairs wasn't screaming or crying, though there was plenty of both. It was the rhythmic crunch of boots on snow, repeated thousands upon thousands of times. Crunch, step, breathe. Crunch, step, breathe. Hour after hour, until the sound became a hypnotic nightmare that haunted men's dreams for the rest of their lives. Temperature was another enemy that showed no mercy. Winter temperatures regularly dropped to 50 below zero Fahrenheit. At those extremes, human flesh freezes in minutes. Exposed skin turns white, then black, then simply falls off. Men lost fingers and toes without even realizing it until they tried to use them. Some lost entire hands and feet to frostbite, the dead tissue blackening and rotting while they were still walking. The cold played tricks that would drive men insane. Their breath froze and fell to the ground like snow. Whiskey turned solid as ice in the bottle. If you spat, it would freeze before hitting the ground, landing with a crystalline tinkle like broken glass. Men's beards became solid blocks of ice from their frozen breath, and they had to break them free with hammers each morning just to open their mouths. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of these trails was how quickly death could strike without warning. Avalanches were the ultimate nightmare, and they came with almost no warning. The sound started as a distant rumble, like thunder rolling across the mountains. Then it grew louder and louder until the entire world seemed to be screaming. Snow and ice moving at 60 miles per hour, carrying boulders the size of houses, sweeping everything in its path into oblivion. On April 3rd, 1898, Palm Sunday, the Chilkoot Trail experienced its deadliest day. A series of avalanches struck throughout the morning, burying everything in their path under tons of snow and debris. The first slide hit around dawn, catching 200 gold rushers completely off guard. 20 men vanished beneath the White Death in seconds. Survivors frantically dug through the snow with their bare hands. Following muffled screams and gasps for air, they managed to pull everyone out alive from that first slide, but it was just the beginning. More avalanches followed throughout the day. Each one brought fresh terror, fresh casualties. Men who had survived the first slide were caught in the second. Those who escaped the second were buried by the third. By the time the mountain stopped its killing spree, over 65 souls had been crushed, suffocated, or frozen beneath the snow. Bodies wouldn't be recovered until spring thaw revealed the full horror of what had happened. The survivors described sounds that would haunt them forever. The initial roar of moving snow that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The sudden, complete silence that followed, broken only by weak calls for help from somewhere beneath their feet. The scraping of shovels against ice as they dug desperately for signs of life. The moment when those calls stopped coming, and they knew another soul had been claimed by the mountain. Yet, even as bodies were being pulled from avalanche debris, more gold rushers kept coming. Ships arrived daily in Skagway and Daya, unloading fresh waves of dreamers and desperate men. The trails became clogged with humanity, creating traffic jams of suffering that stretched for miles. Men stood shoulder to shoulder in blizzards, unable to move forward or back, slowly freezing to death while surrounded by hundreds of others experiencing the same fate. The supply situation made everything worse. Canadian authorities required each person to bring a full year's worth of food and equipment, but hauling that much weight was physically impossible for most people. They had to make trip after trip, carrying what they could and caching the rest at stations along the trail. This meant that supplies sat exposed to weather and thieves for weeks at a time. Men would return to find their food spoiled, their equipment stolen, their hopes of survival rapidly dwindling. Starvation became a constant companion on both trails. When food ran out, men boiled leather boots to make a bitter broth that might keep them alive another day. They ate the rotting flesh of dead horses, knowing it would make them violently ill, but desperate enough to risk it. Some resorted to cannibalism when faced with the choice between eating human flesh or certain death. though these incidents were rarely spoken of and even more rarely recorded. The mental toll was perhaps the cruelest punishment of all. Strong men broke down sobbing like children, overwhelmed by the endless cycle of suffering and despair. Others simply snapped, wandering off into the wilderness in states of complete delirium never to be seen again. The combination of physical exhaustion, malnutrition, extreme cold, and constant fear of death created psychological pressure that few human minds could withstand. Yet somehow, against odds that seemed impossible, 30,000 people actually made it through. They survived conditions that would kill most modern humans within hours. They endured hardships that make our worst nightmares seem like pleasant dreams. But how did they do it? What techniques, what strategies, what inner reserves of strength allowed them to conquer trails that claimed so many lives? The survivors who made it through developed techniques that would make the difference between life and death on these frozen killing fields. First, they learned to read the mountain like a language written in snow and ice. Experienced guides could smell an avalanche coming hours before it struck. They watched for subtle changes in wind direction, listened for the almost inaudible creaking sounds that meant snow was ready to let go, felt vibrations through their boots that warned of instability above. These men created buddy systems that went beyond simple partnership. They moved in groups of 3 or 4, never allowing anyone to travel alone. When one man collapsed from exhaustion, the others would distribute his load and carry him if necessary. They took turns staying awake during the brutal nights, feeding fires that meant the difference between waking up alive or never waking up at all. The sound of wood crackling in those tiny stoves became a lullaby of survival, each pop and hiss a promise that dawn might actually come. They also learned to build shelters that could withstand conditions no human was meant to survive. Using techniques borrowed from Arctic peoples, they dug snow caves that provided insulation from winds that could strip flesh from bone. The irony wasn't lost on them that the very snow trying to kill them also became their salvation when properly used. Inside these frozen cocoons, body heat could keep temperatures just warm enough to prevent death, though comfort was never part of the equation. Food became an obsession that consumed every waking thought. Those who survived learned to ration not just their physical supplies, but their mental energy as well. They developed a mechanical mindset that broke the impossible journey into manageable pieces. Don't think about the summit. Think about the next step. Don't think about the next week. Think about the next hour. Don't think about home. Think about breathing. The smart ones also learned to modify their equipment in ways that weren't mentioned in any survival manual. They attached metal cleats to their boots using wire and nails, creating primitive crampons that provided grip on the icy steps. They fashioned makeshift goggles from pieces of wood and dark glass to prevent snow blindness, a condition that left men stumbling around completely helpless in broad daylight. They learned to stuff their clothing with newspaper, moss, even their own shed hair, anything that would provide an extra layer of insulation. But perhaps most importantly, they learned to harness something that can't be bought or taught: the power of absolute desperation. When death becomes the only alternative to moving forward, the human body can accomplish feats that seem impossible. Men carried loads that should have crushed their spines. They walked on frost-bitten feet, where the bones were visible through blackened flesh. They climbed when every muscle fiber screamed in protest, when their hearts felt ready to burst, when their lungs burned like they were breathing fire. The psychological techniques were just as crucial as the physical ones. Survivors learned to enter a kind of trance state during the worst portions of the climb, mentally removing themselves from their suffering bodies. They created elaborate fantasy worlds in their minds, imagining warm beaches, hot meals, comfortable beds, anything to escape the frozen hell surrounding them. Some talked constantly to themselves, maintaining a running commentary that kept their minds occupied and alert. Others found strength in rage, pure, burning hatred for the mountain that was trying to kill them, for the weather that showed no mercy, for their own weakness that had brought them to this point. They channeled that fury into forward motion, using anger as fuel when their bodies had nothing left to give. The mountain became a personal enemy to be defeated rather than a force of nature to be endured. Prayer became a survival tool for many, regardless of their previous religious beliefs. Not necessarily prayer to any specific deity, but a desperate reaching out to anything that might be listening. The vast, indifferent wilderness. The rhythm of repeated words helped regulate breathing and heart rate during the most strenuous portions of the climb. Whether divine intervention played a role or not, the mental comfort of believing in something beyond themselves helped many push through moments when giving up seemed like the only rational choice. The successful survivors also developed an almost supernatural ability to read other people's condition at a glance. They could tell when someone was about to collapse from exhaustion before that person knew it themselves. They recognized the early signs of frostbite, hypothermia, and altitude sickness, conditions that killed quickly if not addressed immediately. This skill often meant the difference between losing a partner and keeping the group together. Communication became stripped down to its absolute essentials. Words were precious commodities in the thin, freezing air where every breath was an effort. Successful groups developed hand signals, facial expressions, and grunts that conveyed complex meanings. A nod could mean, "I'm okay, keep moving." A raised hand could mean, "Stop, danger ahead." A particular grimace could mean, "I need help, but don't want to admit it out loud." They learned to sleep standing up, leaning against their packs during rest stops, too brief for proper sleep, but too necessary to skip. They mastered the art of eating while walking, chewing frozen meat and hard bread that required jaw muscles strong enough to crack nuts. They developed techniques for dealing with basic bodily functions in conditions where removing clothing for even seconds could result in fatal frostbite. The most successful groups also learned to steal from the mountain itself. They scavenged equipment from those who hadn't made it, stripping useful items from abandoned camps and frozen bodies. This wasn't callousness, but pure survival instinct. A good pair of boots taken from a corpse could mean the difference between walking out alive and becoming a corpse yourself. They learned to see death not as tragedy, but as opportunity, a harsh mathematics of survival that would have horrified them in their previous lives. Navigation became an art form practiced in conditions where landmarks disappeared and compasses froze solid. Experienced trail survivors learned to read the subtle differences in snow texture, the way wind carved patterns into drifts, the angle of shadows during the few precious hours of daylight. They memorized the locations of every cache, every shelter, every relatively safe spot along routes that claimed lives daily. But even with all these techniques, with all their preparation and determination, survival often came down to pure chance. A storm that arrived an hour later, an avalanche that struck 100 yards to the left, a cache of food that hadn't been stolen by other desperate souls. The difference between the 30,000 who made it and the 70,000 who didn't was often nothing more than luck, timing, and the brutal randomness of nature's fury. The psychological scars these survivors carried would last lifetimes. Men who conquered the deadliest trails in history found themselves unable to sleep without nightmares of endless climbing, unable to hear wind without expecting avalanches, unable to see snow without remembering the faces of those who didn't make it. They had achieved something extraordinary, something that tested the absolute limits of human endurance and will. Yet, as they finally crested those killing passes and saw the vast wilderness of the Yukon stretching before them, many realized that the deadliest part of their journey was just beginning. The trails had been a test, a brutal elimination round that separated the strong from the weak. But reaching the Klondike alive was only half the battle. Now they faced an even greater challenge, surviving in a land where gold fever drove men to madness, where lawlessness reigned supreme, and where the real killing had only just begun. But the mountain passes were only the beginning of their nightmare. Once survivors stumbled down from those icy peaks, gasping and broken, but somehow still breathing, they faced a new kind of hell that would test everything they thought they knew about human endurance. The descent from the passes brought them to a series of frozen lakes that stretched like mirrors of death across the wilderness. Lake Bennett, Lake Tagish, Lake Marsh, each one a treacherous gateway that had to be crossed before winter locked the entire region in ice so thick it wouldn't break until spring. But here's the catch that killed so many who thought they'd already survived the worst. They had to build their own boats. Picture this scene. Thousands of men who had never held a saw properly in their lives, standing on the shores of Lake Bennett with axes in their trembling hands and desperation in their eyes. The sound that filled the air wasn't the ring of expert craftsmanship, but the dull thunk of inexperienced blows against green timber, punctuated by curses that would make sailors blush, and the occasional scream when someone buried an axe blade in their own leg instead of the log. These weren't boats in any real sense of the word. They were floating coffins cobbled together from whatever timber could be found, sealed with pine pitch that cracked in the cold, held together with hope and prayer and nails that bent more often than they drove straight. The shoreline became a graveyard of abandoned attempts, half-finished hulks that would never see water, their builders either dead from exhaustion or smart enough to turn back before the lake claimed them too. But the truly terrifying part wasn't building these death traps. It was launching them into water so cold that falling in meant you had maybe 3 minutes before hypothermia shut down your brain forever. The lakes weren't calm either. Sudden storms whipped up waves that could swamp a poorly built boat in seconds, sending its occupants into water that felt like liquid knives slicing through their skin. Those who managed to get their boats into the water faced navigation challenges that would challenge experienced sailors, let alone desperate gold seekers who couldn't tell a bow from a stern. Hidden rocks lurked just beneath the surface, ready to punch holes through thin wooden hulls. Sudden wind shifts could drive boats into rocky shores where they shattered like eggshells, scattering supplies and men across beaches that offered no shelter from the elements. The sound of boats breaking apart became a familiar nightmare along these waterways. First came the sharp crack of wood splitting under pressure, followed by the desperate shouts of men realizing they were about to die. Then came the splash of bodies hitting water so cold it stopped their hearts before they could even attempt to swim. The lucky ones drowned quickly. The unlucky ones made it to shore and died slowly from exposure, their wet clothes turning to ice armor that drained their body heat until their organs simply stopped functioning. Even those whose boats held together faced horrors that tested their sanity. Imagine spending 18 hours rowing across a lake in a leaking boat, your hands so numb from cold you can't feel the oars, water slowly rising around your ankles as you bail frantically with anything that would hold liquid. The constant fear that the next wave might be the one that swamps your boat completely, sending you to join the dozens of bodies already floating face down in the dark water. Navigation became a deadly guessing game played with frozen compasses and landmarks that vanished in sudden blizzards. Men rowed in circles for days, burning through their precious food supplies while going nowhere. Others followed shorelines that led to dead ends, forcing them to backtrack through waters that grew more dangerous with each passing hour. Some simply vanished, their boats found weeks later floating empty. Their occupants disappeared without a trace into the vast wilderness. But surviving the lakes was only half the battle. Beyond them waited the Yukon River system, 500 miles of the most treacherous waterway in North America. This wasn't a gentle river meandering through peaceful countryside. This was a monster that had been carving through the landscape for millions of years, creating rapids that could tear apart boats and men with equal indifference. The worst of these killing grounds had a name that still makes experienced river runners nervous: White Horse Rapids. Here, the entire Yukon River squeezed through a narrow canyon, creating standing waves 15 feet high and whirlpools that could suck down a boat and never spit it back out. The sound alone was enough to break men's nerve, a constant roar like artillery fire that could be heard for miles, growing louder and more terrifying with each mile downstream. Approaching White Horse Rapids, gold rushers could see the spray shooting up into the air like geysers, the water white with foam and fury. Along the banks lay the wreckage of boats that hadn't made it through, splintered wood and scattered supplies marking the spots where dreams had died in seconds. Local guides charged $50 to pilot boats through the rapids, a fortune that most couldn't afford, leaving them to face the monster alone. The technique for surviving Whitehorse Rapids wasn't really a technique at all. It was controlled panic. You pointed your boat toward the narrow channel, said whatever prayers you knew, and held on as the river grabbed you and threw you forward at speeds that made your eyes water. The boat would hit the first standing wave and launch into the air like a rocket, crashing down with enough force to drive your teeth through your tongue. Water crashed over the bow in solid sheets, filling the boat faster than any human could bail it out. Men who survived described the sensation as being inside a washing machine filled with ice water and broken glass. The boat bucked and twisted like a living thing trying to throw them off, while waves higher than buildings crashed down from every direction. Some boats were literally torn apart by the violence of the water, their occupants scattered into the churning foam, where they disappeared beneath the surface, never to be seen again. Those who made it through the rapids often found their boats so damaged they barely stayed afloat long enough to reach the next calm stretch of river. But there was no time to rest, no opportunity for proper repairs. Winter was coming fast, and every day spent fixing boats was another day closer to being trapped in the wilderness when the river froze solid, sealing their fate beneath tons of ice. The psychological pressure of this constant race against time broke as many men as the physical dangers. They could feel winter breathing down their necks like a hungry predator, see ice forming along the riverbanks each morning, watch the days growing shorter with terrifying speed. Sleep became a luxury they couldn't afford. Food became fuel to burn rather than meals to enjoy. And every decision became a calculation of survival versus speed. Disease stalked them along every mile of their journey, turning their own bodies into enemies as dangerous as the environment. Dysentery left men doubled over with cramps that felt like knives twisting in their guts, forcing them to make frequent stops that ate precious time from their race against winter. Scurvy rotted their gums and loosened their teeth, making it agony to eat the hard bread and dried meat that formed their basic diet. Pneumonia filled their lungs with fluid, leaving them gasping for breath and air that was already thin and cold. The smell of sickness became as familiar as the smell of wood smoke and unwashed bodies. Men coughed up blood and kept rowing because stopping meant certain death. They developed fevers that made them delirious but couldn't afford to rest until the fever broke. Some died quietly in their sleep, their boat partners waking to find corpses stiffening beside them, faces frozen in expressions of final agony. But perhaps the cruelest enemy was hunger, a constant gnawing pain that never left, never gave them peace, never allowed them to think about anything except their next meal. The required year's supply of food was based on calculations that assumed perfect conditions and no waste. Reality was far different. Supplies got wet and spoiled, were stolen by other desperate men, or simply ran out faster than expected as their bodies burned calories at rates that would horrify nutritionists. Men learned to catch and eat things that would have disgusted them in their former lives. river rats, caught with improvised traps and roasted over tiny fires that gave off more smoke than heat. Fish so small they were mostly bones, swallowed whole because there wasn't time to pick out the edible parts. Tree bark boiled into a bitter soup that provided almost no nutrition, but at least gave their stomachs something to work on besides acid and desperation. The truly desperate resorted to measures that tested the boundaries of civilization itself. They fought over scraps like wild animals, sometimes killing each other for a moldy piece of bread or a can of beans. They ate leather, boiling their own boots and belts into a gelatinous mess that might keep them alive another day. Some ate the flesh of dead horses they found along the trails, knowing it would make them violently sick, but unable to resist the protein their starving bodies craved. Cannibalism, though rarely spoken of in polite company, became a reality that some faced when the choice was eating human flesh or certain death. Bodies of those who hadn't made it were found with pieces missing, carved away by survivors who had passed beyond the boundaries of normal human behavior into a realm where only staying alive mattered. These weren't evil men who had chosen to become monsters. They were ordinary people pushed past the breaking point by circumstances that would test anyone's humanity. The mental toll of these choices haunted survivors for the rest of their lives. Men who had eaten human flesh to stay alive never spoke of it, carrying the guilt and horror in silence until it drove some of them to madness or suicide years later. The things they had seen, the things they had done, the choices they had been forced to make, created psychological scars that never fully healed. Yet, even as death surrounded them on all sides, even as their bodies failed and their minds cracked under pressure, many of these gold rushers discovered reserves of strength they never knew they possessed. They learned to function on 2 hours of sleep, to work with hands so frostbitten they couldn't feel their fingers, to make life or death decisions while delirious with fever and exhaustion. They developed an almost supernatural ability to read weather patterns, sensing storms hours before they hit, and finding shelter in places that offered no obvious protection. They learned to navigate by stars they had never noticed in their comfortable city lives, to judge distances across water that played tricks with perspective, to estimate how much daylight remained when the sun barely rose above the horizon. Most importantly, they learned to support each other in ways that went beyond simple partnership. When one man collapsed, others would carry his load without being asked. When supplies ran low, they shared what little they had, even knowing it might mean their own death. When boats were damaged, men who barely knew each other worked together to make repairs that might save everyone or kill them all if they failed. These bonds, forged in desperation, often lasted lifetimes. Men who had shared a boat through the White Horse Rapids, who had pulled each other from freezing water, who had taken turns standing watch through endless nights of danger, became closer than brothers. They had seen each other at their absolute worst and best, had trusted each other with their lives when trust was the only currency that mattered. But as winter tightened its grip on the Yukon Territory and the first successful boats limped into Dawson City, these survivors faced a harsh reality that would shatter the dreams that had sustained them through months of hell. The gold fields they had sacrificed everything to reach were already claimed, already being worked by men who had arrived earlier. The easy pickings, the nuggets lying in stream beds like fallen fruit, existed mostly in newspaper stories designed to sell more tickets north. Dawson City itself was a revelation that crushed as many spirits as the trail had crushed bodies. This wasn't the prosperous mining town they had imagined, with comfortable hotels and civilized amenities. It was a sprawling collection of tents and hastily built shacks, where basic supplies cost more than luxury items back home, where a single egg might cost $1 and a decent meal could run $20 or more. The men who had endured the deadliest trail in history, who had conquered mountains and rivers and their own human limitations, now faced a different kind of survival challenge. They had to build shelter before the true winter arrived, had to find work in a town where labor was cheap and opportunities were scarce, had to somehow make sense of a journey that had cost them everything and delivered almost nothing in return. Yet many of them wouldn't trade the experience for anything. They had tested themselves against nature at its most brutal and discovered they were stronger than they ever imagined. They had faced death daily for months and emerged with an appreciation for life that comfortable people could never understand. They had stripped away everything non-essential and found what really mattered: courage, determination, and the unbreakable human spirit that refuses to surrender even when surrender seems like the only rational choice. The Klondike Gold Rush was ending, but the legends it created would live forever. These were the men who had walked through hell and lived to tell about it, who had survived the deadliest trail in history, not because they were superhuman, but because they refused to give up when giving up would have been so much easier. And as the first snows of true winter began to fall on Dawson City, covering the tents and shacks with a blanket of white that would last until spring, these survivors looked back on the trail that had nearly killed them and forward to whatever challenges awaited in the gold fields themselves. The gold they found wasn't lying in neat piles waiting to be scooped up like the newspaper stories had promised. It was buried in frozen ground so hard that pickaxes bounced off like they were hitting solid rock. The permafrost extended down 20 feet or more, and the only way to reach the pay dirt beneath was to build fires on the surface and wait for the ground to thaw inch by agonizing inch. Picture this. You've just survived the deadliest journey in North American history, and now you're standing over a tiny fire in 60 below weather, waiting for enough ground to thaw so you can dig down maybe 6 inches before you have to build another fire. The smoke stings your eyes and fills your lungs, but you can't move away because that fire is literally melting your path to fortune 1 teaspoon of dirt at a time. The sound of mining in the Klondike wasn't the cheerful ring of pickaxes against rock that you might imagine. It was the dull thud of tools hitting frozen earth, the crack and hiss of fires built on permafrost, the wet cough of men whose lungs were slowly filling with smoke and ice crystals. Every shovelful of dirt had to be earned through hours of fire building, and most of that dirt contained nothing but disappointment. But the real horror wasn't the back-breaking labor or the impossible cold. It was the dawning realization that they had been sold a lie wrapped in golden promises. The richest claims on Bonanza Creek and El Dorado Creek had been staked months earlier by men who were already pulling thousands of dollars worth of gold from their holes. The newcomers, the ones who had survived the trail of death to get here, found themselves fighting over scraps of ground that might not contain enough gold to pay for a decent meal. So, there you have it, the true story of how gold rushers survived the deadliest trail in history. 70,000 souls never made it home, but 30,000 discovered something more valuable than gold itself, the unbreakable strength of the human spirit. If this incredible tale of survival against impossible odds fascinated you, make sure to hit that subscribe button and share this video with anyone who loves stories of human endurance. Sweet dreams, and remember, you're stronger than you think.